Commander Grail stood silently on the bridge of the Yulian warship Indomitable, staring into the vast emptiness of space. The ship moved with the precision and confidence of a predator, slicing through the black void with an elegance earned through countless conquests. Its silver hull gleamed beneath the starlight, and its decks pulsed with activity, strategists analyzing data, engineers maintaining weapon systems, and soldiers standing at attention. Every member aboard the ship belonged to the elite ranks of the Yulian military, the best of their kind, ruthless, brilliant, and unquestioning in their pursuit of galactic dominance. But today was different. Unlike their usual missions, colonize, dominate, subdue, the Yulian High Council had issued a peculiar command. They were not to invade a new world or suppress a rebellion. They were not to dismantle a civilization or harvest planetary resources. Instead, they were to locate and retrieve something or someone referred to only as an ancient weapon, a human. The name echoed strangely in Grail's mind. Human. It was a term he hadn't heard in any strategic briefing or military report in recent memory. In fact, it hadn't been uttered with seriousness in Yulian space for generations. It existed now mostly in folklore and bedtime warnings, cautionary tales told to younglings about an ancient race that had once roamed the stars. Stories of great power, innovation, madness, and ruin. Of a species capable of immense destruction and incredible creation. The stories painted humans as gods, monsters, and sometimes both. One tale claimed that a single human, misjudged and provoked, had inadvertently destroyed an entire species in an act of tragic misunderstanding. Most dismissed these stories as exaggeration, legends designed to frighten or amuse, and yet the High Council, in all their wisdom and caution, believed there was truth buried within those myths. Enough truth that they had diverted one of their most advanced warships and one of their finest commanders to follow the trail. Grail didn't like mysteries. He believed in logic, order, facts, and the idea that a species thought long extinct, or perhaps imaginary, could still pose a threat or offer an asset seemed foolish at best. Still, the council had spoken, and Yulian law was absolute. The only clue provided to him was a coordinate in a forgotten region of space, Terrara Sector, a name so obscure it barely existed in any modern star maps. But it was there, tucked into the edge of a distant arm of the galaxy, orbiting a small yellow star. Third planet from the sun, they called it Earth. "Commander," came a voice from his side. It was Lieutenant Vorin, his second in command. His scales shimmered under the low lighting of the control panel. "We're approaching the designated coordinates." Grail turned, his expression unreadable, but his mind alert. "Prepare for emergence," he ordered. "Keep weapon systems on standby. We have no idea what we're walking into." Moments later, the stars around them shifted as Indomitable dropped out of hyperspace. The planet appeared on their screen, blue and green, swirled with clouds, a delicate-looking sphere of life. For a weapon of legend, it looked surprisingly peaceful. "Scan the system," Grail instructed, stepping closer to the projection. "Scanning now," said CR, the ship's lead scientist. His elongated fingers danced across the screen, feeding data into a sophisticated analysis array. Primitive satellite networks, no significant energy outputs, minimal radio signals, no artificial structures visible from orbit, no signs of spacefaring capabilities. "So," Grail muttered under his breath, "just as the legend said, a pre-interstellar society, or what's left of one." "Shall we proceed with a landing party?" Vorin asked. "Yes," Grail nodded. "Let's see what this weapon really is." They prepped a small shuttle, optimized for atmospheric travel, and selected a team of specialists, soldiers, engineers, a cultural analyst, and Grail himself. As they descended through Earth's atmosphere, the shuttle rattled briefly before stabilizing. The view outside was serene, endless forests stretching in every direction, mountains looming in the distance, rivers glinting like silver veins in the green expanse. The chosen landing zone was an isolated ridge surrounded by dense woodland, far from any primitive settlements detected by orbital scans. As the ramp lowered, the team stepped onto Earth's soil for the first time. Grail inhaled. The air was rich with oxygen and organic scents, a stark contrast to the sterile metallic environment of the ship. Trees towered above them, thick and ancient, their leaves forming a thick canopy overhead. "Spread out," Grail ordered. "Search for any sign of human presence. Ruins, machines, remains, anything." Hours passed. The soldiers moved in careful formation, scanning every crevice, every strange structure buried in overgrowth. Despite initial excitement, nothing indicated the kind of advanced civilization described in legend. Until, "Commander, over here!" Voron's voice broke the silence. Grail rushed through the underbrush toward his officer's voice. There, in a clearing partially reclaimed by nature, stood a massive stone structure. Time had weathered it, vines wrapping around its surface, moss creeping into its cracks. But it remained imposing. Alien, yet oddly familiar. "Is this their fortress?" CR whispered, already scanning the site. "Could be," Grail replied, eyes narrowing. "Or maybe a temple. Either way, it's worth investigating." The team moved cautiously inside. The air shifted the moment they stepped through the entrance. Cool, still, as though untouched by time. The interior walls bore markings, symbols carved with such precision that even after centuries, they remained legible. Murals lined the stone, each depicting strange two-legged beings. Humans. Some showed them farming, others building towering cities. Some stood beside war machines. One mural showed a human raising an arm, light emanating from a device in their hand, some sort of weapon. "They look like the descriptions," CR said, studying one carefully. "Bipedal, 2 arms, complex expressions. Look, here they're side by side with machines. Here they're fighting." "This confirms it," Voron murmured. "They existed, at least once." "We need to go deeper," Grail said. "There must be a central chamber, records, technology, something that tells us what happened to them." They pressed forward into the temple's heart, descending narrow stone corridors until they reached a massive circular room. Shelves of stone and metal filled the walls. Strange devices sat atop pedestals, long dormant but untouched. Dust lingered in the air, yet some machines still emitted a faint hum, a quiet pulse, a heartbeat of a forgotten past. CR approached one device and activated it. With a gentle whir, a hologram flickered to life in the center of the room. A man appeared, human. His skin was light, his hair dark and tied back. His clothing was simple, no armor, no weapon. His expression was calm, focused. "Greetings, travelers," the projection said. "My name is Archist Evans. If you are seeing this, then you are searching for us, for our knowledge, our history, perhaps our legacy. But be warned, the power of humanity is not to be taken lightly." The hologram shifted, showing rapid flashes of human life. War, peace, innovation, collapse, space travel, weapons, families, cities rising, cities burning, the range of human potential on full display. "We are resilient," the projection continued. "Our strength is not in our machines, though they are mighty. It is not in our science, though it is vast. The true weapon of humanity is our spirit, our drive to survive, to adapt, to overcome. We are creators and destroyers. We are hope and chaos. And if you seek to understand us, you must first understand yourselves." Silence followed as the hologram faded. No one spoke. Even the most hardened soldiers, who had seen entire civilizations fall, stood awestruck. Grail slowly exhaled. "This changes everything." He turned to his team. "We came here looking for a weapon, something we could wield, something to give us an advantage in war. But what we found is something much more complex. The Council will want answers," Voron said cautiously. "And we'll give them," Grail replied. "But we're not done here. This isn't just about relics or stories. We need to find one, a living human. Only then will we truly understand what we're dealing with." And so the hunt continued, not for a super weapon to mount on a warship, but for a being whose strength lay in endurance, creativity, and something far more elusive: spirit. Grail looked up at the tree canopy above, the light breaking through in golden shafts. Earth may have been primitive by their standards, but its legacy, its people, might just change the galaxy forever. This was only the beginning. The forest canopy filtered the golden light of Earth's sun, casting shifting shadows over the stone structure the Yulian team had discovered. The ancient ruins stood tall and defiant against time, partially covered by vines and moss, yet still strong and hauntingly elegant. This was no ordinary monument, no random cluster of stones. There was intelligence behind its construction, symmetry in the angles, precision in the carvings, and a sense of presence in the structure itself. It demanded reverence, even from seasoned conquerors like the Yulians. Commander Grail stood at the threshold of the entrance, eyes narrowing as he studied the foreign symbols that framed the arched doorway. The stories had never said anything about temples or stone cities. The legends always emphasized war, fire, and machines. Yet this place, it felt different. It felt sacred. CR, the team's lead scientist, moved ahead of the group and gently brushed his long, articulated fingers across one of the symbols etched into the wall. "These aren't just decorative," he murmured. "They're language, warnings maybe, or instructions. Give me a moment. This pattern looks like a neural logic form. It's recursive, which means it's encoded knowledge." Vorin stepped beside the commander, spear-like rifle slung casually over one shoulder. "It's strange. There's no defensive perimeter, no remnants of weapons outside. If they were as dangerous as the stories say, why leave their history so exposed?" "Because they didn't fear being forgotten," Grail said, voice low and distant. "They expected to be remembered." The group pushed inside. The temperature dropped as they entered the ruin, a stark contrast from the humid forest outside. The air felt preserved, like it hadn't been touched in centuries. They passed murals, large detailed scenes of human life, engraved and painted onto stone with remarkable artistry. The figures were unmistakable. Bipedal beings with varied complexions, expressive faces, working, fighting, building. Grail walked slowly past each mural, his many eyes absorbing every detail. One wall depicted a group of humans in armor, holding tools and weapons, their bodies surrounded by strange glyphs. Another mural showed them planting seeds, constructing massive towers, and standing at the helm of ships that reached toward the stars. One image captured his attention, a single human standing atop a cliff, surrounded by devastation, his hand raised to the sky as if commanding lightning. "What were they?" Grail whispered. "Warlords? Scientists? Builders?" "All of it," CR replied, running a scanner across the surface of the wall. "And none of it. They were everything. The complexity of their culture, it's layered. I don't think we can reduce them to a single definition." Further inside, they came to a sealed chamber with a curved metal door embedded into the stone, still humming faintly with residual power. "This mechanism is still operational," CR said with a tone of disbelief. "After what could be millennia, this door is still drawing energy." With cautious precision, CR activated a sequence on his scanner. The door responded, gears grinding slowly as it slid open, revealing a chamber unlike anything they'd seen so far. It was a repository, a vast circular room filled with devices, storage containers, crystalline data blocks, and mechanisms of unknown function. It was dim, lit only by the faint glow of preserved technology. On the far wall, a panel flickered with a pulsing light. "What is this place?" Vorin asked. Grail stepped forward. "A vault, a memory chamber. They left something behind, something they wanted others to find." CR approached the panel and reached for the activation node. "Everyone ready?" Grail gave a single nod. "Do it!" The room shuddered slightly as the mechanism whirred to life. A soft blue light flooded the chamber, and then, without warning, a figure appeared in midair. A human man, holographic, but so vividly detailed he seemed almost real. He was tall, dressed simply in a tunic and trousers, hair pulled back at the nape, eyes calm and resolute. He stood as if he had been waiting for someone to arrive. When he began to speak, his voice was deep, measured, and sincere. "Greetings, travelers. I am Archist Evans. If you are seeing this message, then you have found the heart of what remains of our people." The Yulians froze. Even Grail, hardened by decades of conflict, found himself captivated by the presence before them. "You may be seeking knowledge. You may be seeking power. Perhaps you were told of a great weapon hidden among the stars. If so, I caution you, be careful what you pursue. Evan's expression didn't shift, but his tone grew heavier. The power of humanity is not housed in a device. It is not a weapon you can fire, nor a shield you can raise. Our greatest strength is not found in our machines, though they were mighty, nor in our armies, though they were fierce. No, the greatest weapon of the human race is ourselves. The hologram changed. Images began to swirl around Evans. Flashes of cities rising from deserts, of aircraft streaking across blue skies, of vast oceans being explored, of monuments that kiss the clouds. But then, images of war, bombs falling, fires raging, entire continents trembling beneath mushroom clouds, soldiers embracing in blood-soaked trenches, survivors staring into the rubble of their homes. Our history, Evans continued, is one of paradox. We built wonders beyond comprehension, and we destroyed with the same brilliance. We ventured across the stars not out of necessity, but because we dared to ask, what if? We were dreamers, and sometimes nightmares. The imagery shifted again. Scientists in labs, astronauts in space, children playing under sunlit skies, a woman laughing while planting a tree, a man diving into a river to save a stranger, people marching for justice, standing up for the voiceless. What defines us, Evans said, is not our perfection, but our resilience, our ability to evolve, to adapt, to fight when we must, to hope even when there is no hope. That is the core of humanity. That is what you seek. The projection paused. Then Evans stepped closer, his gaze suddenly piercing. If you wish to learn from us, do not seek our weapons. Seek our will. Seek our spirit. But be warned, the human spirit is not easily understood. It must be lived. It must be earned. With that, the image faded. The room fell silent once more. No one moved. The silence stretched as the reality of what they had witnessed settled in. CR was the first to break the silence. I've scanned the device. That projection, it's not just a message. It's a cognitive echo, a fragment of a living mind. That man, Archist Evans, he preserved a piece of himself to speak directly to those who found this. That wasn't a ghost, Voren said quietly. It was a teacher. Grail looked around the chamber again, at the ancient devices, the preserved data blocks, the murals that now took on new meaning. We came here looking for something to use, something to give us power. He turned back to his team. But what we found is something we might never fully control. A species that refused to be simple, that survived their own worst instincts and kept moving forward, that made war, but also made peace, that destroyed, but also created. He stepped closer to the now silent hologram terminal. If even half of what he said is true, then humanity was never a myth. It was a storm that passed through the galaxy and left behind a legacy too complex to categorize, too powerful to ignore. Voren crossed his arms. What do we do now, Commander? Grail stared into the dim light of the vault. We search for more. There must be records, coordinates, something that tells us what happened to them, if any of them still live. You really think any of them survived? CR asked. I think, Grail replied slowly, that if any species could survive its own self-destruction, it would be the one arrogant enough to call themselves the greatest weapon. Outside, the Earth continued to breathe, quiet and slow, unaware of the visitors who had arrived to rediscover its forgotten children. And yet, in that quiet, something stirred. The Yulians who had come seeking power were beginning to realize they had stumbled onto something much larger. They hadn't just discovered a ruin, they had unearthed a legacy. The chamber still pulsed faintly, as if waiting, as if watching. And the words of Archist Evans echoed once more in Grail's thoughts. The greatest weapon of the human race is ourselves. For days, the Yulian team worked tirelessly, navigating Earth's vast wilderness as they unraveled cryptic texts, deciphered fragmentary holograms, and followed clues buried in overgrown ruins. Though the silence of this planet suggested a long-forgotten past, the deeper they dug, the more it seemed that something, or someone, still remained. The ancient vault had revealed the philosophical core of the human species, but for Commander Grail, It wasn't enough. He needed proof. Not just of what humans were, but what they had become. He needed to find one, a real, living human. At night, the team gathered around makeshift campfires, built using rudimentary survival techniques they were gradually adapting to. Their equipment was efficient, but they had begun to mimic the primitive methods of Earth's original inhabitants, trying to understand not just how humans survived, but why they thrived. Around one such fire, CR, their lead scientist, examined the notes carved onto stone tablets they had unearthed from another ruin earlier that day. "I've translated more of the inscriptions," CR reported, his voice barely rising over the quiet crackle of burning wood. "It refers to a region, a place humans called a sanctuary. It's located somewhere beyond the southern mountains. If the interpretation holds, it was a place of retreat for those who chose isolation over civilization." "A monastery?" Voren guessed. "Perhaps," CR said, "or a refuge. There's a name repeated several times, Ethan." Grail's eyes locked on him. "A name?" "Yes, not a title, a person." There was a long pause. "Then we follow the lead," Grail said, rising to his feet. "If this Ethan is still alive, we're not leaving without speaking to him." The next morning, the team broke camp at dawn, setting off toward the towering peaks to the south. The terrain grew more challenging with each passing mile. Thick forests gave way to rocky hills, and the air grew cooler and thinner. The trees changed, becoming hardier and more twisted, shaped by the mountain winds. Despite the conditions, Grail and his crew pressed on, their mission now more focused than ever. It took them over a week to reach the ridge described in the ancient map. From the highest point, they looked down and saw it at last. A small village tucked into the foothills, nestled between stone cliffs and wide terraced fields. It was almost surreal. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys. People, actual people, moved about, tending crops, carrying supplies, herding livestock. Voren lowered his binoculars. "They look normal. Not warriors, just villagers." "Don't let that fool you," Grail murmured. "A species capable of surviving their own destruction might not look dangerous. But appearances are deceptive." As they descended, the villagers began to take notice. Men and women paused their work, watching the armored strangers approach. Children peeked from doorways and murmurs spread like wind through tall grass. Grail motioned for his team to halt just before reaching the outer boundary. "Keep weapons holstered," he instructed. "No sudden moves." His translator buzzed softly as it processed the whispers among the villagers. "Who are they? Are they here to hurt us? Are they aliens?" After a few tense moments, an elderly man stepped forward from the crowd. He leaned heavily on a wooden staff, his back stooped by age, but his eyes were sharp and piercing. "I am the elder of this village," he said calmly. "Who are you, and why have you come?" Grail took a step forward, offering a gesture of peace. "We come in peace. We seek knowledge. We're searching for someone who carries the essence of what your people once were." The elder tilted his head. "You speak of the old spirit." "Yes," Grail confirmed. "We've read your history. We've seen your legacy. But we need to see it for ourselves. We need to meet a human." The elder considered him carefully. Then with a nod, he said, "There is one. He does not live here, but we know him. His name is Ethan. He lives alone, deeper into the mountains. He comes down sometimes for supplies and news." "Can you take us to him?" Grail asked without hesitation. "I can," the elder said, "but you must understand, he is not a prophet. He is not a soldier. He is simply a man. And that is precisely why he matters." The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, the elder led them along a narrow mountain trail. The path wound through steep ravines and thick woods. The air turned colder, thinner, and the ground became more treacherous. Still, none of the Yulian soldiers faltered. They had crossed galaxies. A few jagged cliffs would not stop them. Finally, after nearly a full day of travel, they reached a secluded clearing. A small cabin stood at the center, simple, hand-built from local timber, with smoke curling from its chimney. The rhythmic sound of chopping wood echoed from behind it. The elder raised a hand and called out, "Ethan, you have visitors!" The chopping stopped. A moment later, a tall man stepped out from behind the cabin, an axe resting on his shoulder. He wore a flannel shirt and weathered pants, boots caked in dried mud. His beard was thick, his arms muscular, and his expression unreadable. His eyes, however, those piercing blue eyes, studied the strangers with wary curiosity. "What do you want?" Ethan asked, his voice deep and even. Grail stepped forward. "We come from far away, from another world. We've uncovered your people's history, your cities, your science, your wars. But none of it answered the most important question, which is, what does it mean to be human?" Ethan stared at him for a long time. Then with a soft grunt, he set the axe against the porch and waved them inside. "All right," he said. "Come on in, but you better be ready for a long talk." The inside of the cabin was humble but clean. Handmade chairs surrounded a wooden table. Jars lined the shelves filled with dried herbs and berries. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over everything. Ethan poured them water from a clay jug and sat across from Grail, folding his arms over the table. "So, you've come all this way to learn about humans, huh?" he said. "Strange. Most people try to forget." "We don't want to forget," Grail said. "We want to understand." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Well, all right then. Let's start here. Being human means contradictions. We build, then we destroy. We love, then we hate. We dream big, then fall hard. But no matter what, we keep going. That's what makes us human." CR scribbled furiously on a data pad while Voran sat silent, eyes fixed on Ethan. "You think that's enough to be considered a weapon?" Ethan asked, clearly amused. "It's more powerful than we imagined," Grail admitted. "You don't realize how rare it is. This ability to adapt, to feel so deeply, to fight not just for survival but for ideas." Ethan studied him. "You say you've read our history, but history doesn't teach you what it feels like. You have to live it." "Then show us," Grail said. Ethan smirked. "All right, follow me." He led them outside again, into the trees behind the cabin. They walked in silence until they reached a cliff overlooking a narrow ravine. A fallen tree stretched across it, a precarious natural bridge. "See that plant over there?" Ethan pointed to the other side. "It's rare. I use it to make medicine, but the only way across is that log." Without another word, Ethan stepped onto the log and walked across, balancing with practiced ease. When he reached the other side, he turned and waved. "Your turn." Grail hesitated. The log shifted slightly in the wind. The drop was steep, certain death if he fell. But he took a breath, stepped forward, and began walking. Halfway across, a gust of wind blew, forcing him to crouch and recalibrate his balance. But something within him shifted. He didn't want to fail. He couldn't. He pressed on and made it. Ethan nodded with approval. "Not bad. You've got a bit of that human spirit in you." One by one, the rest of the team crossed. Each one faced their own fears. And each one, by the time they made it, wore a look not of triumph, but of realization. This was what the archives hadn't shown them. Later that night, they returned to the cabin, and Ethan lit a lantern. "You wanted to know what it means to be human? It's this," he said. "It's about doing the hard things, taking risks, knowing you could fall, but trying anyway. It's about failure and getting back up. It's about fighting for something greater than yourself, even when you're tired, even when you're afraid." He looked around the room. It's not a blueprint. It's not a strategy. It's a way of being. And for the first time since setting foot on Earth, Grail felt something deeper than curiosity. He felt humbled. "We want you to come with us," Grail said at last. "Teach others. Help us understand this spirit." Ethan stared into the fire for a long moment. "I left the world for a reason," he said. "But maybe it's time someone remembered what it really means to be human." The days that followed were unlike anything the Yulian team had ever experienced. They were used to steel corridors, holographic briefings, and battles waged by machines and strategy algorithms. They had mastered the art of conquering from a distance, pressing buttons that unleashed destruction from orbit, rarely getting their hands dirty. But here in the mountains of Earth, they were far from warships and command protocols. Here, under the guidance of a solitary man named Ethan, they were students of something far more elusive than any enemy they had faced: humanity itself. Ethan didn't begin with speeches or philosophical doctrine. He wasn't one to talk much unless it meant something. Instead, he put the Yulian soldiers to work. Real work. The kind that made their backs ache and their muscles burn. They chopped wood. They dug trenches for irrigation. They learned to light fires without plasma igniters, to cook over open flames, to wash in freezing streams, and to navigate the forest by watching the position of the sun or the growth patterns of moss. "This is what your people did?" Grail asked one evening, stirring a pot of stew with a crude wooden ladle. "It's what they had to do," Ethan replied, "not because it was glorious, because it was necessary." Voren grunted as he tried to lift a bucket of water from the stream, struggling with the awkward balance. "We have machines for this." "And what happens when the machines fail?" Ethan asked, not looking up as he sharpened a handmade knife. "Humanity thrived because we didn't give up when things broke down. We found another way." The Yulian warriors, proud and hardened by years of service, found themselves humbled. They were trained in over 100 combat forms, knew the specifications of every starship in the fleet, and could neutralize a target from 300 meters without effort. Yet they found themselves winded after a short hike, frustrated by how long it took to start a fire, and bewildered by the patience required to weave fishing nets or mend broken tools. CR, the team scientist, took careful notes on everything. He was particularly fascinated by the way Ethan used what was around him: stones as hammers, bark as rope, resin as adhesive. "You innovate constantly," CR observed. "Not just when needed, it's built into your behavior." Ethan nodded. "Improvisation. It's one of the most important things we ever learned. You can teach tactics, you can build weapons, but you can't program instinct. That only comes from being pushed to your limits." He began pushing them, gently but relentlessly. Each morning began at sunrise, regardless of weather. Ethan would wake them with a simple command: time to move. No alarms, no blaring lights, just his firm voice and a new task waiting. One day they were hunting, the next they were building. Another day they were asked to sit still for hours, observing a deer trail and reporting the movement patterns of the animals. At first, the Yulians questioned the purpose of these exercises, but slowly, clarity began to take root. They were learning discipline, not the kind that came from obedience to command, but the kind forged in hardship and necessity. They were learning to read nature's signals, to respect the balance of ecosystems, to survive without dominance. They began understanding what it meant to coexist instead of conquer. Ethan was not gentle with them. He expected effort, correction, humility. When Voren complained that building a shelter from wood was beneath a trained soldier, Ethan simply handed him a saw and said, "Then prove you can do better." It wasn't long before Voren's hands were covered in blisters. By the third week, Grail noticed something unexpected. The soldiers no longer looked to him for orders. Instead, they looked to each other. They shared tools. They helped one another without being asked. They laughed, cursed, encouraged. They were changing. But the most profound shift came not in their routines, but in their understanding. One afternoon, as the team worked together to finish a new cabin frame near Ethan's, a sudden rainstorm swept in from the east. Thunder echoed across the valley as sheets of rain poured down. The structure wasn't complete yet, and water began soaking the framework. Normally, they would have retreated to shelter, abandoning the task. But Grail shouted, "Cover the logs! Use the tarps! Hold the beams in place! We finish this!" They moved in harmony, hauling material, bracing wood, laughing through the downpour. When the storm finally passed, they stood soaked and muddy, but the frame stood firm. That, Ethan said, walking over with a rare grin, was human. That evening, around the fire, Ethan shared stories. He wasn't a man prone to nostalgia, but something had shifted between them. He no longer spoke to them as outsiders. He shared fragments of his own past, his childhood in a city long gone, his time as a soldier, the day he walked away from civilization and chose the mountains. He told them of the last great war that had fractured the planet and the generation that had decided not to rebuild the old world, but to return to the basics, to rebuild from the soul outward. "You want to know what went wrong?" Ethan asked one night, staring into the flames. "We got too smart for our own good, too comfortable. We forgot that struggle teaches us who we are." We thought peace would come from avoiding pain. But peace only comes when you've faced your pain and come out the other side. CR, sitting beside him, asked quietly, "Why did you stay behind when the others moved on?" Ethan didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "Because someone had to remember." Grail began to see more than a survivalist in Ethan. He saw a guardian, not of weapons or data, but of meaning, of soul. And he understood now that the ancient archives weren't wrong. The greatest weapon humanity had ever created wasn't a bomb, or a beam, or a virus. It was the human heart, flawed, defiant, adaptive, and relentless. One morning, Ethan took them high up a ridgeline. It was a place he said he rarely visited, but thought it was time. From there, the entire valley stretched out below them. Trees like a rolling sea of green, rivers gleaming in the sun. Birds soared below their feet. Ethan turned to them and said, "Tell me what you see." "A peaceful region," Vorin said. "A valuable resource zone," CR offered. Ethan shook his head. "Look again," he said. "Don't just see, understand." The team was quiet. Then Grail spoke. "I see a life worth protecting, not just because it's efficient, but because it matters." Ethan nodded. "That's the beginning," he said. "You're starting to see through human eyes." In the evenings, they spoke more freely. They asked questions about fear, love, sacrifice. Ethan answered honestly, sometimes painfully. He explained how humans loved so fiercely because they were fragile, how they fought so hard because they could die, how they dreamed so far because they were often lost. They listened. They felt. It changed them. Even their dreams began to shift. Grail, once haunted by visions of strategy tables and tactical readouts, began dreaming of forests, of campfires, of climbing that ravine bridge again, not to prove himself, but to help someone else cross. By the 5th week, the Ulians were no longer a military unit. They were something else. They had learned to fail with grace, to succeed without arrogance, to fight with heart, to build with care. And Ethan, for the first time in many years, began to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a future for his species beyond the ruins. One evening, as the stars came out and the fire crackled, Grail looked over at Ethan. "You said improvisation is one of your greatest traits," he said, "but I think it's more than that." "Oh?" Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. "You adapt not just with your hands," Grail said, "but with your soul." Ethan gave a faint smile. "That's closer to the truth than most humans ever got." They sat in silence for a while after that. No words were needed. What had begun as a reconnaissance mission had become a pilgrimage, a journey not to uncover an enemy or exploit a relic, but to rediscover something they had lost, something they had never known they needed. And as the fire burned low and the stars arched overhead, Grail knew they were not just guests on Earth anymore. They were students of humanity, and their education had only just begun. The early morning mist still hung over the valley when Ethan froze mid-step. The Yulian team had been hiking with him through a dense stretch of pine forest, their boots crunching against frosted leaves, their breath visible in the cold air. Commander Grail immediately sensed the change in his demeanor. Ethan's body tensed, eyes narrowed toward the horizon, like an old predator catching the scent of something long familiar. Danger. "What is it?" Grail asked, stepping up beside him. Ethan didn't speak at first. Instead, he raised a calloused hand and pointed skyward. There, barely visible through the breaks in the trees, were the glowing silhouettes of descending ships, sleek, dark, and unmistakably hostile. The burn marks of their propulsion systems lit the clouds with orange streaks, and their flight formation was rigid, militaristic. "They're not yours," Ethan said grimly. "No," Grail replied, voice low and sharp. "Draar Empire. We fought them in the Arkan cluster 2 cycles ago. Ruthless slavers. If they're here, they followed us." Vorin, scanning with a wrist-mounted device, confirmed the worst. 15 ships, troop carriers. Landing vectors suggest they're heading directly for the village. Grail's blood ran cold. They had not only led death to Earth's doorstep, they had led it to the very people who had shown them kindness. "We have to go," Ethan said firmly. "Now, Da'inan." Without another word, they turned back the way they came, sprinting through the undergrowth, branches whipping against their faces, minds racing ahead of their feet. The once peaceful mountains became a race course of urgency. Every step toward the village carried the weight of looming catastrophe. They arrived just as the first Draar carriers breached the valley skies. Panic had already set in. Villagers scattered, parents clutching children, elders being led by trembling hands into makeshift shelters. The air crackled with tension, the kind that precedes all-out war. The whine of energy weapons being charged echoed through the trees. "They're already deploying," CR said, eyes darting between readings. "We'll be outgunned." "We've fought with less," Grail replied, drawing his sidearm. He looked to Ethan. "Can you fight?" Ethan met his gaze. "I can do more than fight." With that, he moved toward the center of the village and picked up a spear, a crude, hand-forged weapon by modern standards, but in his grip it became something more, something ancient and powerful, something human. Moments later, the Draar troops emerged from the tree line, tall, armor-clad, their faces hidden behind jagged helmets. Energy rifles in hand, they marched with mechanical precision, sweeping through the village with cruel confidence. "Surround and subjugate," the lead commander barked through a voice amplifier. "Anyone resists, make an example of them." They expected fear. What they got was resistance. Ethan was the first to strike. With speed and precision that defied logic, he hurled his spear into the nearest Draar soldier, striking the armor's joint at the neck. The soldier dropped. Before the others could react, Ethan was among them, dodging blasts, countering swings, using his environment as a weapon. He knocked a beam loose from a collapsing structure, sending debris into enemy lines. He kicked up dirt to blind optics, grabbed fallen weapons, and turned them against their owners. His movements were fluid, primal, and terrifying. For the first time in the Olean soldiers' lives, they saw war not as a calculation, but as a living fire. "Move!" Grail shouted, flanking to the right. His team spread out, drawing fire away from villagers and forming choke points between narrow paths and structures. They remembered everything Ethan had taught them, using terrain, improvising with debris, fighting as a unit, not a machine. CR, typically behind the lines, constructed makeshift explosives from farming tools and thermal batteries. Vorin dual-wielded scavenged rifles, suppressing advancing Draar squads with surprising agility. They weren't just Yulian soldiers anymore. They were evolving, thinking like humans, fighting like them. But the Draar were many. For everyone they brought down, two more emerged. Their armor was stronger, their firepower superior. It became clear that brute force would not win this. They needed strategy. "Fall back to the cliffs," Ethan yelled. "Now!" Grail understood instantly. The ravine, the one they had crossed during Ethan's lesson. The narrow log bridge, a perfect bottleneck, a trap. They ran. As the villagers retreated toward safety, Grail and Ethan stayed behind to hold the rear. They fought shoulder to shoulder, one with a sleek plasma blade, the other with a bloodied spear. Enemies fell, one after another. The ground was littered with scorched grass, broken weapons, and silence that came only after chaos. When they reached the cliffside, the plan went into motion. Ethan crossed the log first and motioned others to follow. One by one, villagers and soldiers alike made their way across. The Draar, confident in their numerical superiority, pursued, blind to the terrain's treachery. That's when Ethan and Grail made their stand. At the narrow end of the fallen tree, just before the ravine's edge, the two fighters dug in. "Ready?" Ethan asked, eyes locked on the enemy. Grail nodded. "Ready." The Draar charged. Ethan met them first, moving with supernatural grace. His spear darted, stabbed, parried. He kicked one soldier back, letting him tumble into the abyss. Grail followed, striking with newfound ferocity. Their rhythm was perfect. One defended, the other struck. More Draar fell. When the last line broke, when their commander realized this wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter, he shouted the retreat command. The enemy fled, their numbers decimated, their pride in tatters. Silence returned to the cliffs. Breathing heavily, armor scorched and dented, Grail turned to Ethan. "We did it." Ethan smiled, blood on his knuckles. "No, you did it. You've learned what it means to fight for something." Back in the village, the people rejoiced. What had begun as panic transformed into celebration. They had survived. They had stood their ground. And for the first time in generations, the story of humanity's strength had not been whispered from murals. It had been lived. That evening, the village square became a gathering place. Fires were lit, food was shared, music, primitive yet beautiful, rose into the night. Children danced while warriors rested, wounds dressed and stories exchanged. Grail stood at the edge of it all, watching the villagers and his own team blend. The lines between species, between conqueror and native, had faded. Vorn approached, wiping a bandage on his arm. "I didn't think we'd make it." "Neither did I," Grail admitted. "But we did, because we stopped fighting like soldiers and started fighting like humans," Vorn said. Grail nodded. He turned to find Ethan standing apart, quietly observing. Grail walked over. "You saved them," Grail said. Ethan shook his head. "They saved themselves. I just reminded them who they were." Grail looked at him with newfound respect. "Come with us. You've shown us something no weapon ever could. Help us take this spirit into the stars." Ethan looked toward the mountains. "I don't belong out there anymore. My place is here. But you have what you came for." He placed a hand on Grail's shoulder. "Take it, share it, and never forget what makes it powerful." Grail stood silently, unsure how to respond. There was no ceremony, no grand declaration, just understanding. The next morning, as the sun rose, the Yulian team packed their gear. The villagers embraced them like family. Children hugged CR. Elders gifted them hand-carved tokens. The journey back to the ship felt different, like a goodbye, not from a mission, but from something far more personal. As they boarded the Indomitable, Grail looked one last time toward the cliffs where the battle had turned. In that moment, he knew. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The Yulian starship Indomitable cut through the upper atmosphere of Earth, its smooth hull gleaming against the rising sun. The heat of re-entry danced across its reinforced shields, but for the crew inside, the fire outside paled in comparison to the burning sense of change they carried within. Earth was behind them now, visibly shrinking, yet forever expanding in their minds. The planet had given them more than coordinates or relics. It had given them purpose. Commander Grail stood on the bridge, staring down at the blue-green sphere that had, for centuries, been dismissed as legend. It was no longer a forgotten corner of the galaxy. It was now sacred ground, where transformation began. Weeks earlier, they had come to Earth as seekers of a weapon, following the High Council's directive to find the mythical, ancient weapon called human. But what they discovered had no trigger, no core of uranium or beam emitter. It bled, it breathed, it laughed, and it suffered. It taught. It endured. His mind wandered to Ethan, the solitary man in the mountains who had shown them that spirit couldn't be programmed or downloaded. It had to be lived. It had to be earned. That very spirit had turned the tide of a hopeless battle and reshaped the Yulian soldiers, who now stood proudly as something more than conquerors. They had learned to fight not just with tactics, but with conviction. Vorn stepped beside him, gaze fixed on Earth as well. His arm was still in a sling from the fight with the Drar Empire troops, but his stance was upright, solid. "He said he wasn't a teacher," Vorn said. Grail smirked faintly. "Then he taught us by accident." Vorn gave a soft chuckle, followed by a long silence. "Do you think the Council will believe us?" Vorn asked eventually. "They'll believe the results," Grail said. "They'll see the change in us. Maybe not immediately. But once they understand what we've learned, the implications are too profound to ignore." Below them, the curve of the Earth shone with morning light. And even as they broke orbit, the planet didn't look like a battlefield or a ruin. It looked like the beginning of something new. Back on the ground, Ethan stood at the edge of the forest clearing, watching the thin contrail of the departing starship fade into the upper sky. He leaned on his familiar walking staff, weathered and silent, yet steady. Around him, the village bustled with renewed energy. Children laughed as they chased each other across the fields. Men and women repaired damaged homes, reinforced walls, and planted fresh crops. The scars of the battle were still visible, but so was the will to move forward. He exhaled, long and slow, and whispered to the wind, "You'll carry it forward now." He wasn't sad. He wasn't proud in the traditional sense either. What he felt was something deeper, quiet satisfaction. The knowledge that his people, long buried in the myths of others, would not only be remembered but honored, and not as relics, but as a force of influence that would shape the stars. He turned and walked back toward the village, disappearing into the trees like a guardian returning to his watch. Aboard the Indomitable, the return journey through hyperspace was quiet, but purposeful. Gone were the boastful conversations of soldiers eager for conquest. In their place were reflective silences, soft conversations, and shared stories not about glory, but growth. The crew gathered nightly in the common hall, telling tales of Earth not as a target, but as a teacher. CR had compiled detailed records of everything they'd seen. Images of murals, logs of Ethan's lessons, tactical breakdowns of the battle, and philosophical musings transcribed during long nights under Earth's stars. Yet the most important document was the one Grail had written himself. A letter to the Yulian High Council. It wasn't filled with charts or battle strategies. It wasn't technical or cold. It was human, in structure, in tone, in intent. It began not with a report, but with a story. We went looking for a weapon. We found a man chopping wood. We expected firepower. We found fire within. We asked about strength. He showed us sacrifice. We measured capability. He made us feel, and in doing so, he gave us the very thing we didn't know we needed: clarity. The human spirit cannot be engineered. It cannot be forged, but it can be learned. It can be lived. It's the drive to rise again after defeat, the instinct to create in the ashes of destruction, the choice to hope when everything tells you not to. And if that's not a weapon, if that's not the most powerful force in the galaxy, then nothing is. The letter would reach the council in days, but Grail wasn't worried about their reaction. His duty had changed. He was no longer just a commander. He was a carrier of a spark, a lesson, a legacy. And he wasn't the only one. Each member of his team had begun embodying what they'd learned. They no longer barked commands without reason. They asked questions. They offered help without being told. They took time to listen. Vorin began teaching junior crew members about improvisational combat. CR requested a lab where he could test low-tech survival tools. Even the ship's AI had been reprogrammed to use Earth-based metaphors in its communications. An odd but welcome shift. The transformation was not just internal, it was cultural, and it was only beginning. Seeds in the stars. When they arrived back at Yulian space, the Indomitable docked with the High Orbital Council Station, a massive ring-shaped structure that floated above the capital planet. Unlike their departure, there was no fanfare. Just the silent, observant eyes of political delegates waiting to dissect every part of their journey. But Grail didn't present charts or trophies. He presented a tree, a sapling, grown from a seed Ethan had placed in his hand just before departure. Life, Ethan had said. Your people know how to conquer, but can they nurture? This is how it begins. And now, standing before the council, Grail planted it in the center of the ceremonial chamber, a living testament, not of war, but of growth. This is the weapon, he said to the gathered officials. It doesn't explode, it doesn't destroy, but it changes everything. At first there was silence, then questions, then resistance. But change, as Ethan had taught him, doesn't come through demand. It grows patiently, persistently, and already the roots had taken hold. The lesson beyond the story. In the end, the story of Grail and Ethan is more than a science fiction tale of alien contact. It's a reflection of a very human truth, that strength is not always in the fist, but in the will to rise. Not in domination, but in understanding. Not in silencing others, but in listening deeply. The human spirit, raw, flawed, relentless, remains one of the most powerful forces in existence. It has toppled tyrannies, built civilizations, healed after catastrophe, and inspired movements that transcended race, class, and border. And in our world right now, it is needed more than ever, because there are still battles that rage, not with lasers or plasma, but within hearts. Depression, division, fear, anger, injustice. And just like the Yulian soldiers, we too must learn that the greatest weapon isn't in our hands, It's in our choices. To love when it's easier to hate. To stand when we're tired of falling. To believe in someone else's future when ours feels uncertain. To carry the fire of compassion even when the world feels cold. In the end, the ancient weapon wasn't a myth. It was a mirror, a reminder of who we are, of who we still can be, and of what we carry deep within our core into every challenge, every relationship, every moment. The indomitable will to be human.